Welcome back, to the forum today, our webinar. Today we are very honored to have Sarah Fisher and Sue Kilpatrick. Please correct my pronunciation. I pronounce your names wrongly, please. With us today. And the title of the presentation is a very interesting one, an important one, which is supporting the retention and success of online and blended learners, reviewer support provided by student support services. Here is a biography of our presenters today. So Dr. Sarah Fisher is a lecturer at the University of Tasmania. Her research interests are focused on access and pathways to higher education in rural, regional, and remote areas, including parental engagement, equity and success and retention of students with disability in higher education, as well as the governance and processes of the internationalization of higher education. So Sarah has a PhD in education. Professor Sue Kilpatrick is Professor of Education at the University of Tasmania, Australia. Before semi-retiring in 2016, she was Pro-Vice Chancellor Students, at the University of Tasmania, Pro-Vice Chancellor Rural and Regional at Deakin University. And most of her research applies a social capital framework to health, education, learning for work, and/or community development issues in rural areas. She holds a PhD in the economics of education. Now, without further ado, let us welcome our two speakers today. Thank you. Over to you, please.
Thank you. We've actually invited a third speaker along, Dr. Nikki Barnes, who's going to help us out with the presentation today too. Sorry, there we go. So the way we've got today structured, I know it's kind of late in the afternoon for some of us, so we're going to try to keep it within our time period here. But the way we've got it structured is we're going to talk about some work that we did. Well, we started it prior to COVID, and then it went a little, I think it went a little bit into COVID. But I'm going to talk about kind of set the context and review the literature on our topic. And then Sue's going to jump in and talk about some of the different models at the different universities of support services. And then Nikki's going to talk briefly about the student services discourse. And then Sue's going to jump back in and do some of the conclusions. So in Australia, we have a strong mandate to expand access to higher education. And this goes back, well, it goes back longer than 2008, but I just grabbed some reports to show you what I'm talking about here. But we do have, our reports go back, I should have put them all up there, but probably 1985, but prior to that even maybe. But in more recent times, we've had a push to expand access to higher education with the Bradley report, the Halsey review, and the Nepenthe report. Some of these looked at expanding, well, they all looked at expanding different equity groups. The 2018 and 2019 reports looked specifically at expanding access for regional, rural, and remote education. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but what this has done is it's really made a kind of a diverse cohort. It's made our student bodies more diverse. And so we also found that we need to adjust the admission and retention practices in order to engage with this new population that we're seeing in our schools. The other policy that I want to talk about just briefly is a fair chance for all, which was done by what was known at the time as the Department of Education and Employability and Training, I think it was in 1990. This identified 6 different equity groups for students, and these are the groups that most of those reports were looking at. So it was students who identify as Indigenous, students who are from low SES socioeconomic status locations, students who report a disability, students who are women in non-traditional disciplinary areas, students who are from rural and remote locations, and students who are from non-English speaking backgrounds. The thing, when you look at the literature, the thing is with these equity groups, a lot of times if a student belongs to one, they'll belong to more than one. And so this is what's known as intersectionality. So low SES students, for example, can bring a range of different challenges with them. And so a lot of the literature, well, is, when you're looking at online and blended learning, we'll talk about low SES students, using them as a proxy for some of these other groups, because of a low, if the students from low SES, it's possible that they're also from a regional and remote location, or it's possible that they're from a non-English speaking background. And so I guess intersectionality is important to keep in mind as we talk through this, that it's not just one equity group that we're looking at. A lot of the literature, though, that I'm going to talk about does talk about specifically low SES students, but they can be used as a proxy for some of these other groups as well. The other group that's not mentioned, wasn't mentioned in that report in 1990, are mature age students. And so there was some really good work done by Nicole Crawford a few years ago, looking at this specific cohort. And just to set the stage for in Australia, in 2018, all Australian higher education students, of all the higher education students, those aged 21 or up made up more than half of the student body. So I know 21 is not that old, right? But that puts you into the mature age group. But you can see that there's a lot coming from metro areas, interregional, outer regional, but even more coming from remote areas. Of them, females made up a lot, the vast majority. So in metro, 61.6%, interregional 68.3%, outer regional 69.9%, and remote 74.4%. So this is, I guess my point here is that this is a really diverse, we've expanded access to higher education. We've ended up with a really diverse population in our universities, which is a really good thing, but it's different than what had been there before. And the support systems and support services need to adjust to that. The other thing is a lot of these students end up being online and blended learners as well, especially the ones, coming from remote places. And then, as I said, we started this work before COVID, and then COVID obviously pushed us into, very much into this space. And now at some universities, this is still the predominant, even if they have students back on campus, they're still, all lectures are online still. And so they're in more of a blended situation. So this is our new normal here to some extent. We do know a few things. The literature can tell us a few things about these online and blended learners, even though it's a fairly kind of a new space. We know that entry directly from high school is no longer a standard path, and that the age of students varies quite a bit. We also know that the predominant mode of distance learning is some variant of online learning today. And we also know that blended modes are very common. We also know that research tends to focus on students from non-traditional backgrounds. So when students go through university, and actually prior to when they get to university, there's all sorts of different support services that are offered to them. Our research right now is what I'm going to talk to you about is starting at that phase of the student life cycle when they've entered university. So not looking at what's happened, in school prior to getting to university, but once they've entered the university. There's academic support and there's non-academic support that's being offered. And we know that academic support, we know that it's widely acknowledged, it's not disputed, that these services are really beneficial. And these services can be a range of different kinds of things. It can include course and study services and alternate exit points along the degree. It can be orientation programs prior to, in that week before the semester starts. It can be programs focused specifically on first-year students. It can be, academic preparation. A lot of these students in this newly expanded group cohort of students, population of students, might not have the academic skills or the preparation that the traditional students would have had. And the support study skills is another area that we know that universities tend to offer support for. The thing is that for online students right now, often these supports are designed to mirror what the support would look like for face-to-face student support. But we know that online and blended learners are different. And so support services need to take that into consideration. The literature also tells us that non-academic support is really beneficial when you're talking about retention and success of students. And this can, these things range from social activities on campus to create more a sense of integration and a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Employment support programs, the literature talks about those a bit, such as work integrated learning programs, part-time employment, leadership programs, mentoring programs. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. It's a little bit of a gap in the literature. Childcare can be a really important support, a type of non-academic support, the literature tells us. Also counseling, health and well-being, that sort of support is very, very much offered. And financial aid and scholarships are another type of non-academic support that the literature talks about. I will say that in general, with the exception of the financial support, this is a gap in the literature. There are some studies, and I've listed them here. Most of the research for non-academic support focuses on financial aid and scholarships, not so much on the other things. The literature also tells us that there's a few things that we need to take into consideration when we're considering online learning and retention there. And like I said before, most universities are offering online and or blended learning. We know that students' conceptions of teaching and learning are different. The way they think about how knowledge is produced and how knowledge should be transferred is different. Their knowledge about learning is different. We know from the research that non-traditional students tend to hold reproductive teacher-centered beliefs. So they think, what I mean by that is that they think that it's kind of rote memorization. The teacher tells me and I do it. I reproduce what the teacher is doing, what the teacher is giving me. And especially the online students are finding it very hard to adapt to other study modes when they're, and that's harder. That's a lot harder when you're trying to do things online. There was a literature review done in 2016 that looked at factors affecting the retention of online students. And they identified several of those factors. Lack of awareness of supports available. A lot of times the students just aren't aware of the supports. There's also been research that has shown that no matter how many times, despite emails or links on, what we use at UTAS is Milo, but they're on their learning platforms, on their learning interfaces, despite the big buttons there and stuff, or posts about it on discussion boards. For some reason, it doesn't click with the students, the online students. They think it doesn't apply to them, especially if they're distance students. It doesn't apply to them. It doesn't. They just, for some reason, they don't see it. They don't access that. There's a lot of misconceptions relating to cognitive load about what online learning is going to take. They think if they don't have to go and sit in a lecture, they can, it's not going to take up any of their time, even though they still have to watch the lectures and participate from home. There may be social and family factors. There may be motivational factors. There may be technological constraints. There may be a lack of teaching staff understanding of online learners. A lot of the teachers were just kind of thrust into this in COVID and haven't quite worked out the best way forward. There's also teaching staff limitations of using technology. A lot of the teachers have found that a lot of their time is now focused on technology rather than developing content. It's figuring out how to get your lectures recorded, how to get your lectures available to these students, answering questions on discussion boards. And there's also a lack of training for teaching staff in this area. The other thing the literature talks about in this space is learning spaces for virtual and face-to-face, because we do have a blended situation sometimes. And the literature is telling us that it's really important to create inclusive, integrated learning spaces, not just, when you have a lecture, not just having a quiz question in there that says click here, and then they know that you've engaged, or you have to post on a discussion board once a week, but actually having the student feel like they belong and integrating with them integrating them into the larger group and interacting with them. He also says that it's important to acknowledge the value and differences of these students that these students bring to the classroom while providing access to new ways of thinking and expressing themselves. There's a whole new group of people that are attending university that have really diverse backgrounds and really diverse perspectives, and that just adds to the richness of the classroom and the learning environment for all the other students there. So it's really important to draw that out. And so collaborative approaches are needed. You need to work with rather than act on. The other thing the literature talks about is online student preferences. One study said that the online cohorts, it's heterogeneous. We know that it's diverse, and it requires purposeful, proactive, and timely, focused on early intervention, participatory guidance, preparedness for online studies, skill development, and social and academic engagement. We know that and the engagement part's important. We know that distance students, especially those online, are unlikely to use the university academic or non-academic student support services. They prefer geographically close face-to-face support. And so the first reaction is usually to turn to somebody who's geographically close to them, whether it's family or friends or whoever they're living with, or perhaps some sort of support that's available to them in their town, rather than accessing, something via the internet or via the online, the web page that the universities provided. They'd rather have a person to talk to rather than to go through some sort of web portal to get that. The other thing is that if they do reach out to the university for support, they will most likely seek out their support from teaching staff or their peers for academic and psychosocial support. And so that's important to understand, because that the students, they're the one kind of warm body that they're interacting with is the lecturer or their professor. And that is the person that they reach out to. That's the person that they've started to forge a relationship. But that person is usually somebody who's, an expert in whatever it is they're teaching on. They're not necessarily an expert in providing support or pastoral care for the students. But that's the way it's going. And so it's important for universities to recognize that. The other thing is that the research is finding, and you'll note this is from 2009. It's not new news, but students expect support to be available when they're studying. And these days that can be 24/7. And so students are, they're working on their assignment. It's, 10:30 on a Saturday night. They have a question, they want support. And so that's something that's changed, and the system the support services need to be able to address that. If we move on from the student life cycle, their way through the university, that, they transition out and either move on to a different degree, or they hopefully move on to a job of some sort. This is another gap in the literature. There's not a lot of research done, which isn't to say the support's not being provided, but there's not a lot of research done about this support. There is some research that's looked at mentoring and work integrated learning and how that can be helpful in transitioning out to employment and post-grad study. But this is another, if you're looking at the student life cycle, this would be a gap in the research in terms of support services. And the last thing I'm going to talk to you about before I switch to Sue is about professional development for staff to support students. So we know that students are tending to turn to their teaching staff for support. But I guess we know that we need enhanced training and support for online learning. We know that we need appropriate resources for this. We know that the students are turning to their teachers for the support that if they were on campus, they may go to, to somebody else for that, but they're going to their teachers. And so there is a need for, as Crawford points out, there's a high emotional labor demands of teaching for a vulnerable cohort, and their teachers need to be supported in their supporting of the students, if that makes sense. The other thing is a lot of times in Australia anyway, we have sessional staff who are teaching, and they are often unaware of academic and non-academic support that could be available to the students and to themselves for that matter. So there's a recognition of these needs, but there's little research conducted in these areas. So I'm going to hand it over to Sue, and I'll mute myself, and she's going to talk to you about some of the research that we did looking more specifically at this.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk to you about is some findings from a project that was actually led by one of our colleagues, Professor David Kemba, that looked at the student journey from, really before starting university, right through to that transition out that Sarah just mentioned. We called it the Admissions and Success Project. Sarah and Nikki and I did a section of that project, or led a section, where we looked in particular at the student journey and the support services along the way. So we took a holistic look. So we reviewed the literature, as Sarah's just explained. And then we looked at 4 quite different universities, in all Australian universities. Remembering most of this was done pre-COVID, so before we plunged into that online working from home, studying from home model. We really found that there was no one size fits all, but Sarah, if you could just move to the next slide. What I'm going to do is take you through the models that we developed of the 4 universities. Don't try and read what you can see in the screen now. We're going to look at them one at a time. But the purpose of this slide is twofold. One is to introduce the 4 universities, which were the University of Melbourne, the University of Wollongong, Griffith University, and our own university, the University of Tasmania. And just from looking at the slide that you have up there, you can see that when we mapped from the point of view of the student, so starting out on the left-hand side before they perhaps even made up their mind that they might want to enroll in university, to the right-hand side when they're transitioning out, as Sarah just said, into hopefully a job or a further degree, that the universities look quite different when we analyse the way they trained their staff and the way their services were designed. And before I move on to discuss each one, I should say our data came from mapping what was available on the university's websites, which is what students could see, and interviews with student support staff at a number of them from different support services at each of the institutions. So if we could move now on, Sarah, to the next slide, which is the University of Melbourne. So for those of you who are not from Australia, you may have heard of the University of Melbourne. It's one of the leading universities in the country, rates really highly in international studies. University of Melbourne, at the time we looked at it, only did face-to-face learning. And even now, whilst they do record lectures and so on, they're still a mainly face-to-face university. If you look at their student body and you think about what Sarah's just told you about how student bodies are changing, the student body at the university is really pretty traditional. Most students come straight from school, so there are not that many mature age students. They study on campus because it's a prestigious university. They've got very good university entrance scores. So here when we digged a little deeper, we found there are some real strengths in the way that students were supported once they got to university. So yes, the university engaged with them outside the university, and it worked with schools on aspiration programs and so on. But once they got inside the university, these different student support services around scholarships, admissions, the non-academic and academic support services, and their training for the teaching staff in the faculties and colleges worked together, and secondly, had great extensive two-way communication with the faculties and colleges. And they also ran mentoring programs right the way through. So students were pretty well engaged. So we looked at that model and we said, well, actually, your model pretty well matches your student cohort. And that's a pretty fair and reasonable kind of way to go about designing your student support services. So then next we moved on to University of Wollongong. So here you can see straight away, you've got a different combination of those brown blobs and blue blobs, but you've still got the student journey going through the centre. Now, for those of you, again, who are not familiar with the University of Wollongong, it's in just south of Sydney. It has campuses in a number of regional centres, small campuses, as well as a large campus in the city of Wollongong. It teaches, although we say they're online learning and face-to-face, it does more face-to-face than online learning, though that's online learning has increased certainly since COVID. So this is one of the universities where there's a large non-traditional cohort, older students, a lot of them are low SES. So what we found at the University of Wollongong was, yes, they had some good links between their aspiration programs and programs in schools and in communities, not just schools. They were quite well linked to their internal student support. So the support services knew who was coming, what they were like, and they also engaged with family and community deliberately separately, which is an interesting feature given, as Sarah mentioned, that students often go to their communities, particularly for non-academic support. We did find, though, that whilst there was really good internal communication within support services, the communication with the faculties and colleges and the regional campuses was not so much designed in as the staff made it work. There were excellent personal relationships, and they made sure they referred students to people. There was also some really good staff training there. So again, pretty good match was our summary. So if we move to our third university, we've headed north to Griffith University, which is located main campus in the outskirts of Brisbane, has a large campus in the regional city of Ipswich. So you're starting to get and Ipswich is not a wealthy community. So you're getting a large low SES cohort in that peri-urban regional kind of student body. So again, a lot of those non-traditional students, a mix of face-to-face and online learning. So what did they do? Well, they really coordinated their student support services well. They actually tracked and monitored students as they went through from recruitment, so outside before they started, right through to graduation and transition out. So that was quite individualized. It wasn't cohort based. There was communication and training with the faculties and the colleges, two-way again, which is great. A little bit of technology mediated services, which, given what we've just heard about non-traditional student cohort, may not be such a good match, but you can see quite a different way of designing services, and again, well coordinated internally. And then we move to our fourth model, which is our own university, the University of Tasmania. Perhaps rather sadly for us, given that this is where we work, University of Tasmania had a rather siloed approach to student support. University of Tasmania has not just the largest proportion of low SES and rural and regional students in the country, but actually the largest cohort of both in terms of numbers, even though it's not one of the larger universities. The University of Tasmania also has, even before COVID, a very large online offering, and that's increased since COVID. Most students will at least do blended learning. It's probably very difficult to get a degree with fully face-to-face. There will be exceptions, I'm sure. So we've got lots of those mature age students, and the ones that you saw on the Coles report sitting in their van outside a library. So they've got internet access because they can't afford it at home, with a child they're babysitting, working on their laptop. That's a typical picture of some of the students here. So here there's one-way communication from the student support services to the students, and when the students want to contact support, you can see the little wriggly orangey arrow there. They have technology mediated communication back to student support services. And similarly, the faculties and colleges, whilst they get some training, don't really have any structured interaction or communication with the support services. So basically, this model perhaps could be improved, and one of our aims is to do so. But there's more to it than just the models. I'm going to hand over now to our colleague, Dr. Nikki Barnes, who's going to talk about the kind of discourses that sit alongside these support services. Over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, so this was another component of the big project that we were looking at. What I've done, what the work that we did here was to have a look at the interviews with a whole heap of student services support or student support services staff across all the 4 universities. And so that staff ranged from everyone from those that answered the phone to those who were leading student support services staff across as a unit. So what we tried to do here, though, was to have a look at some of the really positive aspects of what the staff were saying they were doing and the ways they were understanding. And we analysed the data using or looking for the principles or the broad thinking that was going on and the conditions that were required by the universities to put those principles in place. And then, of course, the practices that supported them as well. When we drew it all together, these were the ideal. So none of the unis did all of the things that I'm going to identify here. And sometimes they did the exact opposite to what we're going to suggest is good support service. But what we wanted to do through this is to challenge an underlying deficit understanding of equity students. So we came up with 3 principles. You'll see the first one on your screen there. And what I just quickly want to do is speak to each one of those, and then we'll have a look at a model that we put together that we constructed from this discourse. So the first one there is the first principle we identified out of the discourses was that people held more value than the processes and issues of the universities, and they were a starting point for any planning and for any interaction that was going on. So within this discourse, there seemed to be this will to privilege people over processes, over technology, over economics. People were at the forefront of services, which again links back to some of that the literature that Sue and Sarah have identified. And what was happening is that what they were talking about was that people preferred to speak to another person, not to get online and have a look at a website or try and get counselling services or whatever it happened to be able to interact. The other part of this was that staff were the face of interpreting policy and processes. So students weren't confronted with a piece of paper or a policy. They had a staff person that was able to interpret those and sometimes work around them to be able to support people. So if we have a look at what is happening within those, I'll just give a couple of examples. So the conditions for enabling this idea of putting people first was that people were celebrated when they were spoken about. You know, some of the staff were talking about the rock stars within their unit. They also talked about how support was actually embedded right across the university. It just wasn't in the support services. It was an understanding that the whole university was taking on. In general practice, if you have a look at the bottom left-hand side, there was a focus on human interactions. There was always strong and supportive leadership. I won't go through all these, but there was structural cohesion. So you could see the links right across the university. And I think for me, the big one was the very bottom one. There is this idea that there is responsibility on the university to make changes rather than for students to make changes to adjust to the uni. So uni was looking at how they could interact with students rather than expecting a fully fledged university student to arrive on the doorstep. Some of the ways that they practiced these things was through academic mentors, individual student advocates. They used to draw on outside support, but it went beyond university life as well. So it wasn't just their academics and their learning, it went into a whole range of other things like housing support, financial support, and it didn't stop once the degree was over. Can I have the next slide there, please, Sarah? So the second principle was about blue sky thinking, and it was this idea that it was required this reaching for the stars type attitude to be the best. So the university wanted to be the best, and so therefore there was no limits on the creativity that they drew on. The universities that had these really great student services were also the drivers of thinking rather than followers of thinking. They put in place measures. For example, one of the unis was working around gender issues that had come up in a news issue at one point in time. Another uni was really focused on Aboriginal issues and being able to incorporate Aboriginal people into the university. And so what they were doing was actually putting in place these measures prior to those becoming issues in the public sphere. And so they were forward thinking on those agendas of equity. If you have a look at the little diagram there, some of those things were about encouraging and celebrating the people and the actions that were happening at the uni level. But also the university was taking responsibility to make changes in being responsive towards students. If we have a look down at some of the general practices, universities would acknowledge mistakes and faults that they'd made. They were quite open to saying, okay, well, we did the wrong thing. This is what we're going to do about it. But they were also then on the forefront of acting to make change towards things like social justice. Next slide, Sarah. Thank you. The final principle that came out of the discourse was that the universities, any of the university interactions were proactive. They, rather than being reactive to things that were going on, they were on the front foot and moving forward. They acted before they were required to act. Often things come through in law or issues come up and the government wants action on them. These universities were making, or some of the universities were making steps to be in the forefront of acting on issues that were arising. They also not just reacted to or acted in a proactive way, but they went beyond the measures that were required of external agencies. So it wasn't just comply with these measures, it was, okay, let's comply with it, but let's make our uni the best responder to those issues. And often it wasn't because it was a thing that benefited the uni. They did it because it was the right thing to do or the moral thing to do. So it wasn't just that they did things because they had to, they did it because they wanted to and didn't necessarily get anything back in return. They also provided all the resources that were needed for action to be taken. So in this case, the conditions were proactive and openly responsive. So the university was proactive and openly responsive, and they were willing to tackle the hard issues head on. So they didn't just dismiss issues or pretend they were doing things. They were actually tackling them head on and responding in ways that were supportive of students. And then finally, thanks, Sarah. What we ended up doing then was taking these discourses, or the three principles, and then all the conditions and the practices that came out of that, and put them together in a bit of a model to be able to say, well, what is a really great supportive student services? And what does that look like? Generally, when you do a Foucauldian analysis, which is what we did here, it tends to be destructive. So it pulls apart things and tells you what's not working from them. And we wanted to sort of steer away from that and make a more productive use of that deconstruction that we were doing. And so we came up with this supporting a diverse student body matrix. And what we did in here was combine the discourse analysis we did, and we drew on two other models that were out there in the literature. One was from Spawn, who had a look at institutional behaviours and the idea that, you know, universities could either be inward looking or looking out into external orientations. The other thing that Spawn added to this was with the institutional culture. So she suggested was that culture in institutions could be strong, which meant there was a good alignment with goals of the university, or it could be weak. So in some places it could be obstructive to people being able to adapt or move forward. The other model we had a look at was Gale's demo model. And what they were looking at is the likelihood of effectiveness of university programs, having a look at the characteristics such as, and you'll see these in the model, assembling resources and characteristics and people-rich collaborations. And so we put those into the matrix. And so if you have a look at the matrix, you can see the three principles at the top. Then you'll have a look at the strategies, is the next line down. If you have a look at valuing people, the things that sat underneath that came from Gale and from the discourse analysis. The blue sky thinking came just from the discourse analysis, as did the proactive thinking. The institutional culture was from Spawn. The internal external orientation was from Spawn. And finally, the assembling resources came from Gale. And so we put all the conditions and the practices that we gathered up from the discourse analysis and then divided them. And you can see down there the characteristics in those boxes of all the things that could create a really great student support services model. And we did this not to be judgmental. We would hate for this to be taken away and then used for unis to judge each other about their student services models. But we wanted it as a tool to be able to put a challenge out there and say, you know, are your student services like this? This is the ideal, but what are the extra things we could be doing to make these support services match the students that are coming into the uni? And just let me just draw out a couple of ideas very quickly from the table. So in the first column, valuing people, if you go down there, what you might see in a really great uni is that the university adapts to the students rather than students having to adapt to uni. If you have a look at the blue sky thinking, go down to the last box there, universities respond and go above beyond the requirements to be the best that they can do. If you have a look at the proactive interactions, universities are proactive and openly responsive. If you have a look at institutional culture, down to the third box there, they demonstrate these joined up structures right across the uni rather than having them all segregated out. Internal and external approaches, down to the fourth box, have a look at that one. Recognition that the uni is an integral part of society and therefore has an osmotic relationship with the outside. So people are able to move in and out of the uni, even if they aren't enrolled in the uni. And the last one there is assembling of resources. And what Gail says is that, or what our discourse showed us, was that financial support, financial literacy, information and advice was always readily available. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm handing back to Sue. Is that right?
Oh, yes, thanks, Nikki. Now, I'm just conscious we've gone way over time. So I've got one of the points that we want to make here is there are heaps and heaps of places. If you're looking for some research in this area, there's a whole long list of them. I'm not going to go through them now, but this is a spot ripe for research. So just look out for that. I'm sure the presentation will be available separately later. So if we could just flip on to the next slide very quickly. Thanks, Sarah. There are some conclusions, which I'm going to actually read these out to you whilst we have a look at our final slide, which is a bit of a plug for the book, which came out of the project that we've just worked on. So we between us have written a number of chapters in the book. So please, catch up with that one. But really, support services are the key to success once students have started study, and online students in particular. You need to think about them separately from your traditional students. In particular, remember that your teaching staff are the people that your online students actually interact with, and there's a huge load placed on them because they are the main contact point. They need to be well trained, they need to be supported, and they really need to know all about what services the institution provides. So I'll leave you on that note with urging you to delve more into student services. And we have a heap of references, of course, because we're academics. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Many thanks, Sarah, Sue, and Nicola. Yes, and a very informative session. I'm sure all agree that this sharing session has saved us many months of needing to read about support system, in higher education. Thanks so much. So now is a Q&A session. Any questions from anyone here virtually, please? Any questions? Please turn on your mic and just speak up. Greg, is that?
Just one quick one. If you want to put, I'm going to put you on the spot, team, and just say, so if there was one or two takeaways on what we should be doing now, what should we be taking to our team, our school, our university? What should we be doing from that's really going to make a critical difference?
Well, first of all, make sure that everybody, and remember your sessional staff are often the front line of some of these big first-year units. Make sure they understand the needs of online students, the diversity of students that they're teaching, and what services the university offers and how to get in touch with them, rather than just join the virtual queue, actually how to really get in touch. I think that's the biggest band-aid that you could apply, or the heart starter or whatever. So that's my number one takeaway.
Can I throw another one in there? I think it's the people orientation, that people come first. And that, with COVID, the big move has been very online and very technology and very just click the button and go and find that information type thing. And unis have been moving that way because of the economics of putting people in place. But one of the biggest things was that people should be the front of our student services.
And I would just combine those two and say, rather than aiming for engagement, which is a word I hear a lot now, is aim for integration, aim for creating a community to get everybody, no matter where they're sitting or who they are, involved and feeling part of a community. And then that network, you know, that will stay with them as they move out of university and enter the job market, and they'll, you know, that will just serve to benefit everybody in the end.
Thanks, Greg, for your question, and thank you, to our presenters for their, really insights, that benefit us a lot. Anyone else, please? Oh, there's a question in the chat box. How can I get the book you mentioned above? I think 3 principles may be helpful for online learning and blended learning. Yes. How can we get the book you mentioned?
Well, it should ask your library. You can, it is on the Springer link. You can buy chapters individually if you can't persuade your library to buy it, or if you want a particular chapter when you look at the contents, because as authors we have the equivalent of preprints. There's a chapter that one of us has written. Email us and we might be able to help you with a private copy of the chapter.
So much. So thank you. Yes. Anyone else? Any further questions?
And I'll put the link in the chat. Good suggestion.
Oh, thank you. Masita has a comment here. One thing that came to my mind is for the support for international students. Yes, definitely much needed. Yeah. How do we facilitate students' equality and equity? That's from Mong Mong, Myanmar. So there's this question from a participant: in online education, how do we facilitate students' equality and equity?
Oh, that's a huge question, isn't it? It's about people. I think it starts with knowing the student body. It starts with making sure your learning space, virtual or face-to-face, is inclusive. It actually starts before the whole thing about this project was it started with admission, but actually it really starts with outreach to students beforehand. So it's about who comes to your university, and then it's about the way they're treated equally. I think that's probably a whole nother project, another presentation.
And I think one of the things too is that, I mean, just very simply start by acknowledging that everybody's bringing a different perspective to the table, and that's gonna add a richness to the classroom, and everyone is encouraged to share their perspectives, and to be able to draw on the experiences that the students do have, even though they may be different from your own as a teacher, whatever your background is, but to draw on that. There's lots of different ways of learning and of knowing, and it's important to acknowledge that and to take advantage of all of that's brought into the classroom.
And I think I'd just add to that, just have a think about those principles online. How do you make people be first? How do you be proactive? How do you do that blue sky thinking and allow that to be happening in translating that into an online forum?
Thank you. Yeah. Other questions? If not, I think we are about time to move on to the next session. Last question, if there is. No? All right, please join me one more time in giving huge thanks to our speakers today, Sarah, Sue, and Nico. Thank you very much. Right.
Thanks very much, Sue, Sarah, and Nico, for your amazing presentation.
It is, yes. Thanks so much. So if it's okay, we'll move on to the next session. Yeah. So the topic of the next session is online teaching difficulties and performance. Yeah. of BC and BED teachers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. So here is a little brief about our presenter today. Is Monico Malube. Yeah, Monico is a graduate of a Bachelor of Secondary Education major in English, and he finished his MA in Education, majoring in English. He is currently taking a PhD in Educational Management, and he has got 9 years of teaching experience in both basic education and college. So without further ado, let us welcome, our next presenter, Monico. Monico, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, we hear you clear.
Okay, I'm so sorry for that noise outside. Anyway, so good afternoon. I'll be sharing my screen now.
Yes. Please, yeah. You need to unmute your mic.
Okay, sorry. Okay, good afternoon once again. I am Nico Malubay from Philippines. I will be sharing a research. It's an action research in a very small private institution in the Philippines, in Davao City, in Mindanao. That's the third island in the Philippines. We have Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So I'm from the southern part of the Philippines, and it is a private institution that caters college, junior high school, senior high school, and elementary. So I was the program coordinator back then, and during the pandemic, I was inspired to really make a research on this topic. And this topic is online teaching difficulties and performance of BC-bed teachers during COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. Now, BC-bed teachers, so this is BC, it's the school, Brokenshire College. Bed is basic education teachers. So basically, my respondents were the faculty under me, since I was the program coordinator. So my respondents were the BC-bed or Brokenshire College basic education teachers in that institution, in a private institution in Davao City, Mindanao. Now I'll be sharing these research in the following order: introduction, objectives, methods, and then next, the results in discussion. Okay. Now, as we know, institutional leaders believe that performance evaluation is beneficial to their employees and organizations. Beneficial to the employees because it provides opportunities for professional growth, and beneficial to the organizations because it provides increased productivity, which is backed up with many studies. And the same is true when it comes to the educational sector. Teachers are also being evaluated because they have to, leaders have to assess teachers' performance. As cited in this paper, achievement orientation or high achievement orientation shared by teachers and management in both the structural and cultural conditions of closely monitored learning are among the key elements of the effective schools model. And indeed, when we talk about education, teachers' performance play a fundamental role in the academe. Now, there are a lot of studies that suggests importance of evaluating teacher performance. However, none of these literatures explored on teacher evaluation in times of pandemic, or at least minimal of this research now explored on teacher evaluation in times of the pandemic, which is, of course, during that time, a whole different context. And in fact, some may be using the same tool pre-pandemic to evaluate teacher. Before pandemic, teachers were accustomed to the setup that they have until everything been forced to transition online. Hence, the teachers during that time were in danger of being evaluated in the new normal, where some have the difficulty in adapting, yet especially in the advent of new technology and digitalization. In addition, many studies explored on the perceptions and conditions of the students towards online classes, but only few investigated the perceptions, conditions, and difficulties of the teacher. It is because during the transition, teachers' readiness and their difficulties were left unchecked since the school just went on survival mode. So during that time, even our school, we just went on trying everything just to keep operating. And so the readiness of the teachers, the difficulties in terms of this new technology that they have to do were left unchecked, and everyone was just on survival mode, trying to do their job. So the use of technology, sorry. Now, the use of technology resulted to difficulties among teachers, as many research suggested. A research study substantiated some of these problems related to modern technology, which range from downloading errors, issues with installation, login problems, or problems with audio and video, and so on. And moreover, a research suggests that the teacher readiness should be explored, since there are different factors at play during that rapid transition to online teaching and learning. So during that time, whether the teachers are ready or not, they just have to perform their job. And so and yet there were a lot of difficulties happening among the teachers that were left unchecked and considered during that time. Now, furthermore, the choice of teaching evaluation indicators is so problematic issue because, especially in the Philippines, because in several areas, of course, the teachers would have to be checked on like timeliness, relevance, etc. But other than that, yes, it reflects the performance of the teacher. But in the Philippines, for example, especially in small private institutions, it is important to shed light on this because the teacher performance evaluation may break or may make or break the teacher, because it can be used for like promotion or hiring, etc., or even salary determination. And so that is why, since there were a gap between teachers' performance and the lack of study in terms of a difficulty in delivering online teaching learning, I conducted the study which aimed to investigate the relationship between online teaching difficulties and performance of Brokenshire College basic education teachers during the COVID-19 pandemic, which aimed to determine the following: so the level of online teaching difficulties of the respondents, their level of performance, and whether there is significant relationship between the two variables, and if the online teaching difficulties influence teaching performance. In this study, it is a quantitative study utilized correlational research design, which aims to, in this study, aims to determine the relationship between online teaching difficulties and the performance of the respondents. This also used purposive sampling because it is just all about, or the entirety of the population of the teachers of that basic education private institution. The research instrument used was adopted from Soccer et al. On the study perceptions of public university towards online classes during COVID-19 pandemic, to test the teachers' online teaching difficulty. The instrument used to evaluate the teacher's performance is the institutional teaching performance evaluation tool. So it is already a tool used in the institution, which included an assessment from the supervisor, an assessment from on the course development of the teacher, and an assessment or tool on peer evaluation. So this is in this instrument, it is a combination of all of those things, which was extracted or from the principal of that institution. Here's a conceptual framework of the entire study. So we have here that shows an assumed relationship between the two variables. To describe the levels of both variables, mean and standard deviation, were used to measure the relationship. We have the coefficient correlation, and then to test the influence of the variable, we have regression analysis. So here are the results and discussion of the study. So we have here a distribution of teaching performance. So 52% of the respondents got very good, and 47 got excellent score in their teaching performance. You could also see here the distribution of the responses of the respondents in terms of the questionnaire. Here we have the samples of the statements of the questionnaire that was adopted, and then we have here the average 2.621, which is moderate. And as you can see, here are some of the statements, which includes like facing trouble in conducting online classes. We have also here like challenges in terms of communicating with the students, etc. Here is also the result of the level of teaching performance, which is an average of 5.05, which is very good. Now, the result in terms of the relationship between the two variables. So we have here, sorry. Okay, the table 5 shows the correlation analysis between teaching difficulties and teaching performance of the respondents. And the results reveal the p-value of 0.043, which is less than the alpha level, which means that there is significant relationship between online teaching difficulties and teaching performance. Also, the coefficient of -339 suggests an inverse relationship between the two variables. This means that the increase in the online teaching difficulties would likely decrease the performance of the teachers. And the result of the regression analysis. So here in table 6, it presents the results of the regression analysis, which its purpose is to show the significant predictor of online teaching difficulties on teaching performance. And the results reveal that there is a significant inverse effect on teaching performance. So this means that the regression weight for online teaching difficulties in the prediction of teaching performance is significantly different from 0 at 0.05 level. Thus, for every unit increase in online teaching difficulties, there is a corresponding decrease in the teaching performance. This implies that teaching difficulties can hinder the performance of teachers. So in conclusion of the study, this gives us the knowledge that indeed during the time in the COVID pandemic, where teachers were forced or they have to really perform their duties on teaching, even though it's a very new thing for them, especially for seasoned teachers. So we could really we now know that teaching difficulty could really affect the performance of teachers, especially when it comes to the technology and the digital aspect of the online teaching, especially that not all teachers or not all schools are privileged enough to have the knowledge and training when it comes to handling online teaching. Hence, it is recommended that teachers' readiness in online teaching must be assessed further. Also, that school administration should develop training and workshop that would alleviate teachers' difficulty, especially in the use of technology. Lastly, it is crucial that teaching evaluation performance tool must be adapted to the teacher's current setup. So I guess that's it for my presentation of the simple research. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you. Thanks for your sharing. Yes, any questions, please, from anyone here for Nico? Yes, Greg, thanks. Greg, have you got a question for Nico?
Oh, so I did unmute myself. I was trying to I was trying to formulate it as I was thinking there.
Take your time.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. I think that the question I'm asking myself is how significant when we're teaching teachers, which is what my responsibility is. I'm the AHLT here in at UTAS. There's like a double challenge, isn't there? Because there's the challenge for our own colleagues who need to know and understand how to teach online effectively. And then we're also got the challenge of developing our teachers' online learning, because they're going to go into the classroom. I mean, we hope that our teachers in schools and that might not ever face a COVID challenge like we did in the past, but nevertheless, there is an increase in online teaching everywhere. So I just wonder if you've got any comments on that kind of tension between our own capabilities and those of the students we're teaching.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. Indeed, that's a lot and a series of challenges, right? So, for example, yeah, especially for administrators and for us who have to teach and to assure that our teachers are doing their job, especially during the pandemic, when we know that it's actually it's new to all of us. So, I mean, the first question during that time, who will teach who? Who knows what, right? I mean, for example, I could like volunteer to teach the teachers under me, but I cannot ensure that I have all that knowledge to really share to my teachers, because I too need teaching. But that's really one of the biggest challenges during that time. And so I am just like maybe the answer to the question is that, for example, government agencies, for example, in the Philippines, we have DepEd, we have CHED for Commission for Higher Education, and Department of Education for Basic Education, that they have to have the initiative to really teach the students, because our success is a success of the commission or of the department and a success of the entire nation. So if they continue to leave us unchecked, if they continue to leave us untrained, that would also trickle down to the students, right? So in order to empower students, you have to empower teachers. And it's just so sad that during that time, again, that's what I have just said earlier, that we just went on survival mode. And then because there was no manual during that time, what to do, how to do online teaching. And especially for us in this far place in the Philippines, in Mindanao. So I don't know, it was really a struggle. It was really a problem.
Thank you, Nico. Yes, it is, and how we resolve that tension, I'm not quite sure where we go to next. But you know, your presentation sort of certainly sends some signposts of the points we might consider. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question and sharing. Yeah. Yes. Any other questions, please?
No question from me, but I just wanted to make a comment, and I would like to say my thanks to Nico because you were willing to present earlier, I mean, nearly a week earlier. So thank you so much for that. And I think you have shared some really useful insights from your content. And yes, I think we have learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from anyone or comments? I think Momon has something to share with us in the chat box. Momon said, thank you so much for your presentation. Myanmar's issues are low connection, electricity problems, Zoom account security. Yeah, so those are the ones. Anyone else, please?
And I just wanted to ask your research findings, Nico. It just align well with our findings that in the survey that we did in 2021.
Yeah. I was also a participant during that time.
Yeah, yes, and I believe the majority of participants also come from the Philippines. So yeah, we did that survey in early 2021. So I think there are some similarities there about teaching difficulty in the time of COVID, when the majority of universities in Southeast Asia moved to online teaching for the first time, and they were not prepared to do online teaching.
Right.
Yeah, so thank you for the insights.
Thank you.
Right, if no further questions, I'll pass over to Vin.
Okay, thank you so much, Min, for sharing the session today. And I think if the audience, if there are any further question, then we just send out thanks to our wonderful presenters today, Shu, Shara, Nico, to Nico, Nicole, Equitas, and Nico from the Philippines. It's such another wonderful day for the forum. Thank you so much and have a great evening. I will be in touch again tomorrow. Thank you again, everyone, for your amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Vin.
Bye.
See you.
Thank you, guys.